Arthur Dayne's a unique character in the lore. The legend surrounding him makes Arthur seem like he lived thousands of years before the start of the story, but many of the main characters have met or even spent time with him just 15 years back. But because he was so closely tied with his friend Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, there still has to be a veil of mystery around him. The author, George Martin, seems to like this particular part of the lore to remain open-ended. That's why even if fans are crazy vocal about seeing a spin-off of this time period, it'll likely never happen. If it ever did, Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, would be a fan favorite. He's the classic badass overpowered hero. The nickname Sword of the Morning has some deep lore behind it, but it isn't an epithet that's exclusive to Arthur. It's more of a title actually, given to a knight that belongs to House Dayne worthy of wielding their ancestral sword. Doesn't matter if you're the heir or a part of a minor branch family. Any Dayne that's deemed skilled enough gets this title. Usually ancestral swords or even weapons in the story mean that it's made from Valyrian steel, a lost form of magical smithing that created lighter, stronger, and sharper weapons. But House Dayne's sword, called Dawn, is something else entirely. As more books in the series were published, and then finally a supplementary lore book came out, we would get a couple more sentences here and there filling us in on what made House Dayne's family sword so special. In the first book, when Ned Stark dreams about his fight with Arthur Dayne and two of his fellow kingsguard, it's only described as being pale as milk glass, alive with light. Arthur had to sling it across his back, since it's a two-handed greatsword, obviously completely different than what we see Arthur wield in Game of Thrones' adaptation. He's not this quick-slashing, dual-wielding knight, and the books never describe him as a particularly large man, so he probably fought with precision instead of speed with his massive greatsword. Jaime does remember him as being stronger than himself, however, and Jaime's not small of stature. House Stark's ancestral sword that Ned must have used during the Battle of the Tower of Joy, called Ice, was also a great sword, so a good size comparison there. Big enough that Tywin melted ice down into two smaller Valyrian steel swords for this family. But Dawn was forged from the heart of a fallen star, 10,000 years back. Has to be a hell of a sword to last this long. Supposedly the founder of House Dayne witnessed a falling star near his location in Dorne, so followed it to the mouth of a river. This would be the meteorite Dawn would be forged from. The family sigil immortalized this discovery, and their castle in Dorne, Skyfall, was even built on the crater site. So the names Dawn and Sword of the Morning are just themes tying in the sky. Though we don't have any confirmation or anything in the lore, the World of Ice and Fire tries to convince us that Dawn is comparable to Valyrian steel, saying, "Those who would have had the honor of examining it say it looks like no Valyrian steel they know, being pale as milk glass. But in all other respects, it seems to share the properties of Valyrian blades, being incredibly strong and sharp." This family's tradition alone of passing down a legendary sword made House Dayne famous throughout all the Seven Kingdoms. There's even some similarities with the Valyrian race, like House Dayne's occasional pale or silver hair with purple eyes. The only other house in the Seven Kingdoms, aside from the Targaryens, to have these traits. Boys dreamed of being born to the family and having the chance to carry this title and renowned sword. And the most famous of all the swords in the morning over the millennia is Sir Arthur Dayne of the Mad King's Kingsguard. Besides Arthur, we only have two other named swords of the morning, the earliest being 1,000 years back. Davos Dayne, one of the husbands of the first princess of Dorne, conquered the place with the Martells, Nymeria. But the only thing we know about Davos was his connection to the prolific Nymeria, who might just be the most legendary female character in the lore. Not only did she lead her last surviving people away from the Dragon Lords, but also maneuvered her ships around the most terrifying locations to conquer the harsh people of Dorne. The other Sword of the Morning mentioned is Ulrich Dayne. He lived during the era of the Blackfire Rebellions in the Seven Kingdoms, just 100 years back. But if you blinked while reading through one of George Martin's short stories, you would have missed his name drop. When Prince Aegon V is speaking to an older knight, the knight says in a sworn sword, "With axe or lance or flail, he was as good as any knight I ever saw, but with the sword, he was the warrior himself." When Prince Daemon had Blackfire in his hand, there was not a man to equal him, not Ulrich Dayne with Dawn, no, nor even the Dragon Knight with Dark Sister. The fact Ulrich carried Dawn tells us he held the title of Sword of the Morning, but that's all we know. Being in company with Daemon Blackfire and his uncle, the Dragon Knight, is some high praise though. Good thing we know a lot more about Arthur Dayne, otherwise this title wouldn't mean much. When thinking of the best fighters in the story, even in his old age, Barristan Selmy still comes up in considerations. George Martin had to fill us in that 15 years back, when both Barristan and Arthur were around their prime, they were evenly matched with swords. But Dawn would put Arthur over the top in a real match. When we're introduced to Arthur Dayne in the lore, he's already a member of the Kingsguard, serving the Mad King. Catelyn Stark believes he was the deadliest among the 7, and this was a solid Kingsguard. Arthur would regularly enter the lists in tourney jousts like most high-profile knights. Out of the 3 we know of that he participated in, he won 1, while losing twice to his friend Rhaegar Targaryen. It seems like they're written as tourney rivals, because when Arthur did win, it was against Rhaegar. But that's far from his biggest feat. 5 years after being crowned a tourney champion, Sir Arthur Dayne was tasked by the Mad King to lead a mission to take out an outlaw group just outside the city walls. Barristan and Arthur's Lord Commander, Gerald Hightower, had been attacked by the outlaws when protecting the princess. These outlaws were only going after highborns, so Arthur Dayne was next in command, even over Barristan. This is where a younger Jaime Lannister would come across his idol for the first time. He was scrying for another lord taking part in the mission. The outlaw group, called the Kingswood Brotherhood, had the small folks' support at first because the Targaryen kings completely took over their land. They weren't even allowed to hunt in their own forests because it became the royals' official hunting grounds. Taking away some of the land from simpler hunters or farmers built up resentment. It's hard enough bringing home a deer for your family without limitations of where you're allowed to gather your food, and that was just one issue. Whenever the king and his party came around, or anyone of high birth passing through the king's road, some felt they had no obligation to pay for the goods and services provided to them like meals. So a former noble took it upon himself to form a group to capture and ransom highborns off coming into the Kingswood, back to their rich relatives. Until one incident where a member of House Tyrell, who was a knight fighting back, was killed. The Smiling Knight was responsible, who was the cruelest of the Brotherhood, a crime that would have every house at high alert. It was clear no highborn was safe in these parts of the Kingswood. Jaime recalls that instead of just demanding the small folk provide information, Arthur Dayne believed they first needed to make them love them. He paid the small folk for the food we ate, brought their grievances to King Aerys, expanded the grazing lands around their villages, even won them the right to fell a certain number of trees each year and take a few of the king's deer during the autumn. The forest folk had looked to Dayne to defend them, but Sir Arthur did more for them than the Brotherhood could ever hope to do, and won them to our side. After that, the rest was easy. Jaime, along with every other aspiring hero, had his eye on the Smiling Knight, the most dangerous and infamous of them all. The Smiling Knight was a madman, cruelty and chivalry all jumbled up together. He didn't know the meaning of fear. Being the one responsible for taking out the Smiling Knight would mean any squire or knight's greatest career achievement. So Arthur Dayne and Barristan, now with the people's support, found the Brotherhood while rescuing Lady Jane Swan. 15-year-old Jaime held his own during a clash with the Smiling Knight, but Arthur Dayne would have to take over for him, while Barristan took on their leader, Simon Toyne. Even this young, Jaime was one of the best fighters in the realm, but the men around him were living legends. The outlaw's longsword had so many notches by the end that Sir Arthur had stopped to let him fetch a new one. "It's that white sword of yours I want," the robber knight told him as they resumed, though he was bleeding from a dozen wounds by then. "Then you shall have it, sir," the Sword of the Morning replied, and made an end of it. A nice way of writing in some characterization for Arthur. Again, the perfect hero with honor and skill. Jaime was knighted afterwards by his hero, and arrogant Jaime still considers Arthur Dayne to be the better knight, someone he still aspires to be. The next year, Arthur would go on a journey with his friend Rhaegar Targaryen and some of their other allies, then disappear with Lyanna Stark. After Robert's rebellion that took another year, Ned would find 3 Kingsguard members guarding over Lyanna Stark and Dorne, by what's now referred to as Tower of Joy. Instead of helping out in the war that would bring down the Targaryens, Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, Sir Oswell Went, and the Sword of the Morning were ordered by Prince Rhaegar to remain in Dorne on security detail, far from all the action, while Rhaegar eventually rode off to die in a fight with Robert Baratheon. It was 7 Northerners versus 3 Kingsguard, and all we know of the book story is what few words Ned was willing to share with his son Bran. The finest knight I ever saw was Sir Arthur Dayne, who fought with a blade called Dawn, forged from the heart of a fallen star. They called him the Sword of the Morning, and he would have killed me but for Howland Reed. Father had gotten sad then, and he would say no more. Bran wished he had asked him what he meant. Rumors were spreading throughout Winterfell about their lord killing the Sword of the Morning in single combat, but we know that's not true. Ned and Howland Reed were the only survivors. So Ned had to return the ancestral sword Dawn back to House Dayne in Starfall. It was out of respect to his opponent Arthur, who Ned knew was only following orders and had no joy in killing his friends. Plus the added bonus of seeing Arthur's sister again, Dayne, who Ned once had a crush on. Viserys considers Arthur to be the only knight to be his brother Rhaegar's peer. And when Jaime recently looked at his current embarrassing fellow kingsguard, he says, "I learned from Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, who could have slain all of you with his left hand while he was taking a piss with the right." Maybe this line is what made Game of Thrones' writers make Arthur Dayne a dual-wield swordsman. There hasn't been a Sword of the Morning in House Dayne since, but there is a certain disgraced Dayne calling himself Darkstar, who's clearly plotting to forcibly take it. But he'll never be deemed worthy of the title, even with the sword. When a naive Marcella asks Gerald Dayne if he's inherited being the Sword of the Morning, he says, "Men call me Darkstar, and I am of the night." He's the only character so far to show any negative feelings towards Arthur, but that's just out of jealousy towards his distant relative. Gerald believes Arthur wasn't special, just the sword made him famous. Darkstar will never be as loved or remembered as fondly as the last Sword of the Morning.